This is Chapter 7, The Empires of Persia. The Medes and Persians migrated to Persia before 1000 BCE. Both spoke Indo-European languages and were closely related to Aryans. The Medes and Persians challenged the existing Assyrian and Babylonian empires. Cyrus the Achaemenid launched the Persian imperialist campaign. By 558 BCE, Cyrus became king of all Persian tribes, and by 548 BCE, all of Iran was under his control. The Achaemenid Empire stretched from India to Egypt. Cyrus's son Cambyses ruled the empire from 530 to 522 BCE and conquered Egypt in 525 BCE. Darius ruled from 521 to 486 BCE and brought the largest extent of the empire. He also ruled the most diverse empire, containing 70 ethnic groups. In addition, Darius also re-established the capital at Persepolis in 520 BCE. The Achaemenid Empire was ran with a network of bureaucrats to maintain order. 23 strapes, or Persian governors, were appointed by central government. Local officials were selected from local populations. The straps' power was checked by military officers and spies. Together, they implemented formal taxes and standardized coins and laws. They also created the Persian royal road and postal systems. Xerxes brought the beginning of the end of the Achaemenid Empire. Xerxes ruled from 486 to 465 BCE. During this time, he abandoned the policy of cultural toleration. This led to rebellions among the Mesopotamian and Egyptian people of the Achaemenid Empire. In 500 BCE, rebellions by the Etonian Greeks led to the Persian War, which lasted until 479 BCE. Persian rulers were unable to put out the rebellion. Then, in 334 BCE, Alexander of Macedon invaded Persia. In 331 BCE, the Battle of Gaugamela brought the end of the Achaemenid Empire. After the fall of the Achaemenid Empire to Alexander the Great, the empire went through three changes, the first of which came when it became the Seleucid Empire, which occupied the same region as the Achaemenid Empire. In addition to occupying the same region, the Seleucids also applied the Achaemenid system of administration. However, they faced opposition from native Persians and eventually lost North India and Iran. The second change came when it became the Parthian Empire. The Parthians were based in Iran and extended to Mesopotamia. Parthian power stemmed from their heavy cavalry. Like the Seleucids, the Parthians also followed Achaemenid administration. The third change came with the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids began rule in 224 CE. Their merchants brought in crops from India and China. However, by 651 CE, the empire was incorporated into a greater Islamic empire. Persia moved from being a nomadic-based society to having a society made of bureaucrats, free classes, and slaves. Bureaucrats were needed because of imperial administration. They shared power with clan leaders. Free classes were often composed of artisans, merchants, civil servants, and peasants. Slaves were often prisoners of war or debtors. The Persian economy was founded on agriculture and trade from India to Egypt. Agriculturally, Persia produced peas, lentils, onions, garlic, dates, apples, pears, and apricots. They also traded metals, stones, textiles, spices, paper, oil, and wine. Zarathustra created Zoroastrianism after the supreme god Ahura Mazda made him prophet. Zoroastrian teachings were compiled in the Avesta under the Seleucid dynasty. Popularity grew during the 6th century. Zoroastrianism influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
During the late 320s BC, an ambitious adventurer named Chandragupta Maurya laid the foundation for the Mauryan Empire. It was the first state to bring a centralized and unified government to most of the Indian subcontinent.
However, the Mauryan Empire didn't reach its peak point until Ashoka took over. He was recognized more as a governor rather than a conqueror. He spread agriculture and encouraged trade. In an effort to spread trade, he built roads of more than 100 miles long. His death in 232 BCE set in the decline of the Mauryan Empire, immediately collapsing finally at 185 BC.
With the Mauryan Empire coming to an end, India, however, did not crumble into anarchy. Leaders gathered. They formed a series of small kingdoms in order to bring order to large regions. These large regions need to be put in check. I think forming this small series of kingdoms would be really good. Don't you agree?
Yes.
The end of the Mauryan Empire prompted attacks. The Greeks took over Central Asia, however, not lasting very long as the Kushans took over very quickly. It's ours! It's ours! Central Asia is ours! Actually, it's ours. The Kushan Empire embraced modern-day Pakistan, Afghanistan, and northern India. They also played a crucial role in Silk Road networks that made it possible for merchants to travel safely across long distances. During the early century CE, patriarchal dominance became more pronounced in India. Girls would get married as early as 8 or 9 years of age. After their arrival in India, the Aryans recognized 4 main classes of people: priests at the very top, warriors and aristocrats, then peasants and merchants, and at the very end, serfs. Among the most influential of the new religions was Jainism. It became the most popular in the late 16th century BC. This religion believed that everything in the universe, from humans, animals, plants, the air, bodies of water, and even rocks, possessed a soul. Believers were so precautious of their surroundings, so much that they would not even disturb the surrounding air. The founder of Buddhism, coming from a Kshatriya family, was the Tathagata. Born 563 BC, he was seeking a different life. He finally considered the life of a monk. After countless suffering, his demons withdrew and Gautama prevailed. After understanding pain and suffering, he became the Buddha, the enlightened one. His teachings quickly attracted attention. He himself would lead his disciples throughout much of northern India in hopes of bringing spiritual enlightenment to others. Dying at 483 BC, the core of his doctrine was left: the Four Noble Truths. It teaches that all life involves suffering, and that desire is a cause of suffering, and that elimination of desire brings an end to suffering. Buddhism received support from Ashoka. He would reward Buddhists with grants of land and encourage them to spread their faith throughout India. Ashoka built monasteries and stupas and made pilgrimages to the holy sites of Buddhism. Buddhism's popularity mostly consisted of merchants, artisans, and of other low rank in the traditional social order. This was mostly due to the fact that Buddhism disregarded social classes. As Buddhism generated new ideas and attracted widespread interest, Hinduism underwent a similar evolution that transformed it into a popular religion of salvation. It underwent changes in doctrine. A short poetic work known as the Baghdad Judah best illustrates both the expectations that Hinduism made of individuals and the promise of salvation it held out to them. Hinduism had become the most popular religion in India. It taught that only through renunciation and detachment from the world could individuals escape the cycle of incarnation. Its 4 principles of life are obedience to religious and moral laws, the pursuit of economic well-being, and honest prosperity, the enjoyment of physical and sexual pleasure, and the salvation of the soul. These are called Dharma, Artha, and Kama.
Chapter 19: States and Societies of Sub-Saharan Africa. From 2000 BCE to 1000 BCE, the Bantu, the Kushi, the Sudanese, the Mande, and other peoples immigrated into sub-Saharan Africa. Along the way, they displaced as well as absorbed natives along the way. This led to the growing of small communities based on immigrants, which would later form up to create great kingdoms down the road. Early African migrations in sub-Saharan Africa consisted of the settling of the Bantu and other peoples in sub-Saharan Africa. The peoples undertook small-scale migrations over about 2000 CE. The African peoples later built societies on the foundation of small communities that the Bantu and other migrations had generated. The early result of this was that the migration had spread agriculture and herding to almost all parts of Africa. This meant that the natives' original way of gathering resources, which was hunting and gathering, could no longer be. This led to the displacing and absorbing of natives into immigrants' communities. The iron metallurgy was introduced by the Bantu peoples, who about 500 other people learned this skill, and this led to the creation of new iron tools. Furthermore, the cultivation of land was made far easier by these new iron tools, which could be used to clear out land faster, as well as cultivate the land, because they could use stronger tools for any form of agricultural need. After decades of hunting and gathering used by the native African peoples, the new immigrants introduced a new way to collect resources. These two ways were cultivating land as well as herding cattle. This led to multiple agricultural societies being set up, mainly based off of the immigrants. The immigrants also introduced iron tools due to their knowledge of iron metallurgy. This led to more clearing of land and opened up a wide variety of cultivation for the natives as well as the immigrants. The banana cultivation led to a huge population boom, jumping from 3.5 million to over 22 million in only a span of about 800 BCE. After 2 millennia of Bantu migrations, the Bantu had reached their limits. This led them to have to go into a new avenue: government. The political organization of sub-Saharan Africa was based on two types of societies: a stateless society and a segmentary society. The Bantu people set up kin-based societies, which meant that the male heads of the families were the chiefs, and they would compose a council, and the chiefs would lead a wide variety of other villages that were all under their territory. The Kingdom of Congo was one of the prime examples of this, with it being the most successful over the years. It thrived off of this society and later became one of the most active empires. In sub-Saharan Africa, trans-Saharan trade boomed post-migration. This was due to improved transportation technologies, including the camel, which replaced the horse and the donkey in about 7th century BCE, and this gave the ability to the travelers to carry much more. Slavery in sub-Saharan Africa primarily consisted of the act of capturing a slave itself, slave trading, as well as the rare but harmful slave results. Slavery itself in sub-Saharan Africa was mainly just due to capturing prisoners of war and having to make them do something. It was that or be killed. Slaves could also be debtors, suspected witches, and criminals. Most slaves would work as agricultural cultivators, hands helping out with any dirty work that the higher society people didn't want to do. This was because the slaves were the lowest of the low society-wise. Slave trading was due to the expansion of trans-Saharan trade and Indian trade networks, increasing traffic in the need for African slaves. The African slave raiding became very prominent at this time period because the demand for slaves outstripped the supply from Eastern Europe, which had previously been the main source of slaves. Therefore, merchants switched from gold, ivory, and products to the hunt for slaves, which were, the cost of them were far outweighed compared to the gold. The main revolt in sub-Saharan Africa was the Zanj revolt, and it took place on the Swahili coast. It was about 15,000 Swahili slaves who captured Basra, the most important city of southern Mesopotamia, and continued to execute the people in there. This unfortunately failed, and all the people who had revolted were executed, with the leader being tortured and killed. The 14-year revolt demonstrated the power of African peoples and was an inspiration for African slaves at this time, knowing that they could change. The Indian Ocean trade in sub-Saharan Africa consisted of maritime trade routes, the types of merchants, colonization, as well as the spread of peoples and culture. In regards to the maritime trade routes, you had three main trade routes. These were the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean, the east coast of Africa, as well as the Red Sea, which was used to push merchants to these other trade routes. The types of merchants were Indian and Persian sailors, as well as Hellenistic and Roman mariners. Following that, you had Malay seafarers. Colonization was produced by these Malayans. They ventured into the western Indian Ocean from their homeland, and they colonized the island of Madagascar in the 4th and 5th century CE. The spread of peoples and culture was by the Bantu peoples, who would use trading to push themselves up and down the east coast of Africa, settling along the way, creating new city-states, most primarily the Swahili city-states, which gave them the power of having the best location right on the coast. And this led to the Swahili states being some of the most powerful in all of sub-Saharan Africa.
Chapter 30, Industrialization. Industrialization is the transforming of handicraft-centered economies into economies distinguishable by industry and machine manufacture. These technological and organizational changes led to increased productivity. For example, goods could be produced by machines as opposed to being handmade. Inanimate sources of energy were also harnessed at this time, such as coal and petroleum. Large businesses were also formed by the need to invest in more expensive equipment. Britain's industrialization. Britain's industrialization was partly due to the received ecological relief from the U.S. Coal played a very important role in the industrialization, as wood was no longer used as the primary source of fuel. This also expanded the iron production and the usage of the steam engine. People in Britain wanted to use cotton, not wool, which led to the development of the textile industry. A few inventions of this time were as follows. The flying shuttle was invented by John Kay, which sped up the weaving process. The mule was invented by Samuel Crompton, which became the device of choice for spinning cotton. The power loom was invented by Edmund Cartwright, which was first powered by water, then by steam. James Watt then invented the steam engine, which drove mechanical devices that performed work. During this time, smelters also began to use coke, which was a purified coal, to produce iron, and iron production skyrocketed. Then Henry Bessemer invented the Bessemer converter, which is a refined blast furnace that made it easier to make steel. And at this point, steel began to replace iron in industry. And a result of this, transportation technology improved. George Stephenson then invented the steam-powered locomotive, which was more efficient than Watt's. This led to the use of railroads, which linked all industrial centers. At this time, the factory system also replaced the putting out system. And the form of work known as assembly line was used to increase production. Centralized production in factories also brought more workers, although working conditions weren't good and protests were held. For example, the Luddites destroyed many factories in Britain. The industrialization of Western Europe. France. In France, the French Revolution set the stage for industrialization. This was because it both abolished trade barriers and it dismantled guilds that opposed new technology. French engineers also refined technologies that created more efficiency. A boom in railroad construction also led to lower transportation costs. Germany. Germany's industrialization was slower than the rest of Europe's because of political instability. Companies like Bismarck encouraged the development of heavy industry in order to strengthen military capacity. For example, the Krupp firm dominated the following industries: mining, metallurgy, armaments, and shipbuilding. The industrialization of North America. North America built their textile industry in the U.S. by luring British craft workers. Places like New England produced shoes, tools, handguns, as well as being a major cotton industry. The industrialization in North America, in the U.S., spilled into southern Canada. The U.S. had abundant natural resources, but had bad communication. For this reason, better transportation technology was created, which in turn stimulated other industries. Capitalism. The refined manufacturing of industrialized societies led to mass production. A major factor of this was Eli Whitney inventing the technique of interchangeable parts. Henry Ford also introduced the assembly line, which led to productivity gains. Private businesses also formed to profit from market-oriented production. An example is the English East India Company, which organized joint stock companies to spread risk, increase efficiency, and maximize profits. In Britain and France, modern corporations were owned by many investors who bought stocks in the company. These corporations controlled most businesses that required investments in land, labor, or machinery. Monopolies were formed to restrict markets, and trusting cartels formed to control the supply of a product and its price. Industrial societies. Better standards of living in industrial societies led to increased population growth. These also reflected the changing patterns of fertility and mortality. For example, high birth rates and lower death rates. However, lowering birth rates were a result of voluntary birth control, which then led to demographic stability. Urbanization and migration. Urbanization led to increased pollution in both water and air. The burning of fossil fuels polluted the air, and tainted water spread diseases. This led to increased death rates, which exceeded birth rates, so cities only grew by immigration. Income also determined the degree of comfort. For example, the wealthy moved to the suburbs, and working class lived in centers of cities and apartments that were often unkept. Population growth in Europe led to emigration to the Americas, specifically the US. Some of these immigrants were the British, who sought to escape dangerous factories, the Irish, who left during the potato famines, and the Jews, who left because of anti-Semitic policies.
This is a model of the new social classes in the making of an industrial society. The first new social class was the upper class. This class mainly contained captains of industry and business people able to overshadow military aristocracy, or the traditional privileged class. The next class was the middle class. This class held small business owners, managers, engineers, skilled employees, and they were the main beneficiaries of industrialization. The next class is the working class. The working class was the masses of workers. They tended machines and did the heavy labor for low wage. They were mainly in mining and industrial centers. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that they had a voice in political affairs. Industrial families were the basic unit of social organization, but they changed during the industrial age. In early years, families worked together in factories, but over time it was less common for them to work in group as workers left to work up to 14 hours. Families began to live increasingly separate lives. In industrial society, men had stature and responsibility. The majority were wage workers, and work was considered more important than domestic chores. A man's wage was the bulk of a family's income. Upper and middle class men held prestige at home because they were usually the sole providers. Industrial workers usually lengthened their weekly breaks by observing Holy Monday and staying in on Sundays. Leisurely, they attended sport events, gambled, and socialized at bars and pubs. Women didn't experience the same privileges that men did. They often worked long hours pre-industrial times in agriculture and domestic manufacturing because it accommodated their role as workers and moms. In the 19th century, industrial society didn't want or expect women engaged in labor, but encouraged devotion to traditional pursuits, i.e., raising kids, home management, and preserving family values. Industrialization influenced childhood. They had always worked in or around family, but industrial work took kids away from the house for long hours with little breaks, doing pitiful and exploitative work. In the 1940s, British Parliament began passing laws regulating child labour. It restricted or removed them from the workforce. In the long term, industrial society removed kids from the labor process, but agricultural settings demanded kids contribute to family income. Urban industrial societies redefined the role of children. They were motivated by morals and the recognition that modern society needed educated workers. So the government began mandating the legal requirement that education and not work was the focus of childhood. By mid-19th century, industrialization was well underway in Europe, North America, and Britain. Industry brought economic and military power, which meant leaders began seeking it. In the 1870s, both Russia and Japan embarked on campaigns of rapid industrialization, with government authorities sponsoring them. This was done to strengthen societies so they could resist pressure from Western Europe and the United States. In Russia, the Tsarist government encouraged railroad construction to link regions. In the 1860s, there was less than 700 miles, but in the 1900s, there was more than 36,000 miles in railroads. The most impressive was the Trans-Siberian Line. It was made in 1891 through 1904 and covered 5,600 miles. It linked Moscow to the Vladivostok port on the Pacific Ocean. This all worked to stimulate coal, iron, and steel industries, which allowed Russia to serve as a commercial link between Western Europe and East Asia. Russia went through explosive growth when Count Serge Witte was finance minister in 1893 to 1903. Witte oversaw the construction of the Trans-Siberian Line. He also worked to push industrialization by reforming law, protecting infant industries, supporting steamship companies, and promoting nautical and engineering schools. Witte also invited foreign investors to bring their capital and expertise to Russia and encouraged the making of saving banks to raise additional investment funds at home. By the 1900s, Russia made half the world's oil and its steel was ranked the fourth in the world. So as a result of Witte, Russia had large coal and iron industries, and the government demands for weapons supported the massive armaments industry. Imperial authorities wanted to push industrialization, so the government hired thousands of foreign experts to show workers/managers modern industry techniques. The government modernized iron foundries and dockyards made by the Tokugawa shogunate. They also founded new business and opened schools and universities specializing in scientific and technical fields. Government support equals railroad construction, mine openings, banking systems, and established mechanized industries making ships, arms, silk, cotton, chemicals, and glass. When businesses could be self-sufficient, the government sold them to entrepreneurs who made industrial EMPs or zaibatsu. Zaibatsu were similar to the trust and cartels in 19th century Europe and the United States, but they were usually in one family, and zaibatsus usually operated several industries. The Mitsu Combine, for example, owned or invested in many enterprises. They engaged in banking, trade, mining, food processing, and textile manufacturing. Due to an active government and the organization of huge enterprises, by the 1900s, Japan became the most industrialized in Asia. It was also poised for dramatic economic and industrial expanse in the 20th century. The demand for raw materials. Industrialization had deep global ramifications. It influenced economic and social development of societies because it promoted the international division of labor. Societies needed minerals and agricultural products and some other raw materials from distant regions of the world. In the 16th to 18th century, European countries imported things such as sugar, tea, coffee, tobacco, spices, cotton, and other products mostly from plantations. In the 19th century, there was a demand for these commodities because of an increasing population. There was also a demand increase for additional products such as raw cotton from India, Egypt, and the southern United States, and rubber, which came from Brazil, Malaya, and the Congo River Basin. In some lands, the exporting of goods led to the economic development and industrialization. This was notable in lands settled by European colonists such as Canada, Argentina, Uruguay, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, each which saw economic growth through exporting and infusion of foreign capital and labor. This led to flourishing markets and labor-saving technologies. Not all lands were fortunate. Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia also exported, but they attracted little foreign investment and developed a less mechanized industry. Export-oriented agriculture dominated, and cash crops such as sugar, cotton, and rubber were all controlled by foreign markets, which meant most of the profit went abroad, and that meant less funds to building markets and industries. Wealth was in a small group of people that contributed little to development. To compound the problem, dominant financial interests made free trade policies which led to the unrestricted entry of foreign manufacturers. This all limited indigenous industrialization.